तस्य विदुरवरेण्यं भृगो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो नः प्रचोदयात्। ॐ सहना भवतु सहनौ भुनक्तु सह वीर्यं करवावहै तेजस्विनावधीतमस्तु मा विद्विषावहै। ॐ शान्ति शान्ति शान्तिः। श्रुतिस्मृतिपुराणानाम् आलयं करुणालयं नमामि भगवत्पाद शङ्करं लोकशङ्करं शङ्करं शङ्कराचार्यं केशवं बादरायणं सूत्रभाष्यकृतौ वन्दे भगवन्तौ पुनः पुनः। ॐ त्वमेव माता च पिता त्वमेव बन्धुश्च सखा त्वमेव विद्या द्रविणं त्वमेव सर्वं मम देव देव। ओम गुरुदेव भगवान शिव शंकर भोलेनाथ कैलाशपति महाराज की जय। भगवान व्यास जी महाराज की जय। शंकराचार्य भगवान की जय। स्वामी चिन्मयानंद भगवान की जय। स्वामी दयानंद भगवान की जय। स्वामी प्रबुद्धानंद भगवान की जय। स्वामी शुद्धानंद भगवान की जय। साध्वी आनंद ज्योति जी की जय। माता पिता की जय। सभी गुरु देवताओं की जय। सभी गुरु देवताओं की जय। सभी गुरु देवताओं की जय। श्री कृष्ण गोविंद हरे मुरारी हे नाथ नारायण वासुदेवा। श्री कृष्ण गोविंद हरे मुरारी हे नाथ नारायण वासुदेवा। ओम नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय। श्रीमद् भगवद गीता चैप्टर नंबर 6 and verse number 32. We are seeing action, wrong action is not possible for the wise person. The person who has the knowledge about Brahman will never do any wrong action. For him, there is no action, wrong or right. Whatever action he does will be in line with the dharma. Whatever dharma says, seeing the situation, the circumstances, whatever dharma says, the wise person will do accordingly. And he being not a karta, he will not consider himself as the karta of that karma. So there is no wrong action he is doing, he will be doing. Bhagavan says in verse number 32, Atmopamyena sarvatra samam pashyati yu arjunaha sukham va yadi va dukkham sayogi paramo mataha. Atmopamyena Arjuna, O Arjuna, yah, the one who sarvatra, everywhere, sukham va, either pleasure, yadi va dukkham, or pain, atma upmanyena, taking oneself as an example basis, saman, samam, the same, pasyati, sees, sa, that, yogi, the wise person, dharma, the most exalted, mata, is regarded. The one who, the one who is taking oneself as an example, basis in all situation, sees either pleasure or pain as the same, sees all pleasures and pains as the same. That yogi, Arjuna, is regarded as most exalted. Here Bhagavan obviates the problem of whether the wise person can perform any action of adharma by showing that there is no way of his doing that. For such a person, Atma, oneself, is the upama, the example. The self itself becomes the example. Atma upamayam. One who is oneself as an example sees that which is equal in all beings, sarvatra samam pasyati, as being equal to oneself alone. The person does not look upon others from any other matrix except oneself alone. With reference to all being, the vision is equal, the same. One looks upon others as oneself alone on the basis of the example of oneself. This is one meaning. There is also another meaning which we shall see later. In the second line of the verse, the vision of sameness is pointed out in terms of happiness. In terms of happiness and pain, sukham va dukkham va, my happiness, sukha, my welfare is highly desirable to me and therefore I go for it, which is the same for everyone. Every being is equally interested in its own sukha, so I become the matrix, the basis for my interaction with other beings. Similarly, dukkha is what is not desirable for me or for anyone else either. The basis of dharma. Here you can see how dharma itself is born. The very basis of dharma is the universal mutual acceptation of people. What I expect of others is what others expect of me. If what is desirable, sukha, for me is desirable for others, and what is undesirable, dukkha, for me is undesirable for others, then there is a common basis, which is what is meant by dharma. Having the vision of sameness in all being, then the person discussed here does not do what is not desirable. So what Krishna said in the previous verse, whatever the person does, he or she remains in me. Sarvatah vartamanah api mai vartate is further explained here. What was said there could be misunderstood to mean that a jnani could do things that are adharma and yet he remains in Ishvara. Krishna says no. It is not possible, because what is good for the jnani is good for others too. And what is bad for the jnani is bad for others also. If the jnani does not like getting hurt, then he or she is not going to hurt anyone. In this way, non-injury, ahimsa, becomes natural to jnani. That is how jnani decides about the actions he is going to do. He is a viveki. He thinks before doing any action. He thinks, is it right for me? If it is right for me, it is right for others too. If it is wrong for me, it is wrong for others too. Even for a viveki, a simple, mature person, ahimsa is a very common dharma. And for a jnani who has lived a life of dharma and also deliberately pursued and gained the knowledge, dharma becomes spontaneous, very natural. If you look at any crime like hurting another person or any kind of action considered to be a dharma, behind it there is always a small ego. Every ego is small, in fact. A big ego is also small. Any ego being just a bubble filled with air. Whether the big bubble is big or small, it is nothing but air. That is all there is to this ego business. Just so much air, ego itself is a false entity. And this false entity is behind every crime, large or small. Ego is ignorance based. And what kind of ego is this? The ego is ego of an insecure person. An insecure ego that has fear and greed. Because it has fear and greed, it is insecure. Because it is insecure, it is frightened. A frightened person or a greedy person can perform actions that are not very committed to dharma. In fact, all unbecoming actions stem from the insecure ego, and no ego is secure because the nature of ego is isolation. There is duality, dvaita. In Brihadaranyaka Upanishad it is said that whether there is duality, wherever there is duality, there will be fear. Dvityadavi bahayam bhavati. A similar statement is found in Taittiriya Upanishad, conveying the same sense. Udharam antaram kurute ataha tasya bhayam bhavati. The original duality is the duality between individual, Jiva, and Ishvara, the Lord. There is only one duality, which is an ignorance actually. But that is the only duality between Jiva and Ishvara. Jiva Ishvara Dvaita, meaning that Ishvara is something other than you. This Dvaita makes you small. If Ishvara is everything else, you become whatever is left out. Naturally, then you become small. Everything else is infinitely large and you are small. And once this original Dvaita is there, there is the Dvaita between one individual and another individual. Jiva Dvaita. And between the Jiva and the world, Jiva Jagat Dvaita. Now, if the duality between Jiva and Jiva, between Jiva and Jagat is real, then the duality between Jiva and Ishvara is also real. Why? Because if the Jiva Dvaita and Jiva Jagat Dvaita are real, there must be an Ishvara other than this Jagat. Then that Ishvara is also another person, like any other Jiva, and between him and other Jiva, including myself, there will be a difference. All the way there is difference, there being a Dvaita between the Jiva and Jagat and Ishvara. If there is Dvaita between these three, Dvaita between the Jivas, between Jiva and Jagat, and between Jagat and Ishvara, then your isolation is established. Mortality is established. Imperfection is established. Inadequacy is established. All of which are accompanied by fear, greed, pain, sorrow, and so on. If Dvaita is established, then isolation is established. Your isolation is 100%. Then comes all fear, greed, pain, sorrow. Since ego implies isolation, behind every crime there is ego. But Krishna is talking about the yogi who has pricked the bubble of this ego. The bubble ego is no longer there. One ocean alone is there. Ego is ignorance based, ignorance of Atma. Once the ignorance of Atma is gone, all that remains is one Atma, which is Param Brahma. There is no ego anymore. And when the ego is not there, where is the question of the person doing anything improper? The person abides in Ishvara alone. Maya eva vartate. But for sake of argument, you can say that the person can do anything he or she likes, even though the person still does various things. Whatever these may be, or however they are done, the person remains in me alone. This is Shastra. When the Lord says remaining in me alone, it means that person is never separate from him. In other words, the person and the Lord are one and the same. The person who has this equal vision everywhere and no necessity to do things that are not in keeping with dharma. The person naturally sees that what is sukha for him or her is also sukha for others, and what is dukkha for him or her is dukkha for other people as well. However, will the person who has this vision not compromise in any way? The person who has this vision not compromise it in any way. After all, most people understand that what makes them happy or unhappy affect the others in the same way, yet they do not always behave according to dharma. Suppose something becomes so important to this person, it is not possible that the vision will be set aside temporarily at least. In fact, this problem will not arise because for the person who has this vision, there is no action that I am limited. There is no notion of limitness. There is no notion that I am limited. There is knowledge that same Atma is in all beings, and all beings are in one self, Atma alone. The ego for this person is badhita, subletted. It is no more taken as real. Therefore, this person is one for whom ahimsa is natural, which is in fact the spirit of sannyasa. A person who has this clear vision of Atma, who is naturally, spontaneously given to ahimsa, who no longer needs to practice ahimsa deliberately because it is his or her very nature, is described here as the most exalted param among yogis. Among yogis means among jnanis. Now this is one interpretation of this verse, that my dukkha is everyone also consider it as dukkha. My sukha is also sukha for everyone. Therefore, this kind of thought will never rise. Hinsa. It will be for ahimsa. The second interpretation of the verse is, we can look at this verse in another way using the option offered by the word va as, or by adding this word va or to sukha and dukkha. Sukham yadi va dukkham. Here situations are categorized in two-fold way. Those producing sukha and those producing dukkha, both of which the wise person looks as equal. Samana pasyati, samana pasyati. It means that the person sukha and dukkha are the same. Why? Because one looks at them both with the example of oneself alone. Atma being the example, the basis of measurement, the metrics of judgment, the person sees what that which is equal in both sukha and dukkha. How is this possible? Because the person understands the nature of Atma as fullness, wholeness, and from this basis one looks at Sukha and Dukkha, both are within and fullness alone. This does not mean that the person does not meet with situation producing Sukha and Dukkha. The point being made here is that the person looks at all situations, even Dukkha of death, from the basis of Atma alone, because the person knows oneself. Atma is fullness. There is no ripple or reaction, whatever is the situation. To pull it another way, when Sukha comes, the person's fullness does not increase, and when Dukkha comes, the fullness does not decrease. Meanwhile, the person is always with Ishvara. Maye, eva vartate. There is no situation which is going to take the person away from Ishvara. This is the connection with the previous verse where it said, whatever the person does, sarvatha vartamana api. There is no question of the person being away from me, Ishvara, or forgetting me because of any situation involving dukkha or sukha. Why? Because Atma is the example, upama, the basis for the person, the Atma, that is I. Previously it was pointed out that Atma is Parameshwara, Paramatma. Therefore Paramatma is the upama, the example for the person who comes to bear. This particular interpretation is in keeping with the example of the river and the ocean in the second chapter of Gita. There was an example, second chapter of the Gita, which says, chapter number 2, verse number 70, Apuryamanam achala pratishtham samudramapah pravishanti yaduvata tadva atmakam ya pravishanti sarve sa shantim apanoti na kama kami. Apuryamana means fullness, that which is completely filled from all sides, like the ocean, samudra. Achala means that the ocean remains in its own glory and does not move around. Pratishtha is that which is well rooted, meaning the ocean is well rooted in its own glory. Into this ocean water enters apaha pravishanti from different directions. Is the ocean affected in any way by this event? Does the oceanness increase? No. And if no water enters for a time because of drought, etc., oceanness also does not decrease. Ocean do not dry up, nor they overflow. Such situations simply do not occur. Fullness depends on nothing. This example is good one in terms of fullness, that is the nature of Atma. The example holds water, in other words. Whether the water enters or do not enter, the ocean always remain the same. The oceanness does not depend upon any other source of water to the ocean. Similarly, here the yogi, a wise person who is Ananta, does not depend for his or her fullness upon a given situation. Whatever happens, sukha or dukkha, the person sees them both equally. Therefore, he or she remains tranquil. This we had done earlier in chapter number 2. Sashantim apanoti. Whatever objects, kamas, enter from whatever directions through the gate of the 5 sense organs, they do not disturb the person at all. just as the ocean is not disturbed by the waters. Whereas the person who is a desirer of various objects, kama kami, who is dependent upon their presence or absence for his or her happiness, is likened to a pond. If too much water comes in form of rain or flood, you don't see the pond at all. And if there is no rain, it dries up altogether. Similarly, the kama kami is like a yo-yo. If something desirable comes along, he or she goes up, and if it is something undesirable, the person goes down. However, for the yogi discussed here, there is no yo-yo, because he or she remains with me, the self alone. Whatever the tragedy, even if it meets the classical orthodox definition of genuine tragedy, the person remains the same. This is the yogi Krishna is discussing here in keeping with the previous verse. So two interpretations are possible here. The yogi remains the same in any situation, whether it is sukha or dukkha, and the yogi looks upon others as one looks upon oneself. This being so, the person will not perform a wrong action. To treat others as you would have them treat you is applicable to everyone. In fact, every human being is supposed to live this way. What you talk of a yogi, no one can hurt another without getting hurt in the process. Even though it may sometimes seems to be otherwise, we see this even in tennis matches. You begin with love and then you fight to win. And when you do win, you are ecstatic on the way to the net to shake hand with your opponent. You jump up and down and throw your rackets into the air. You are very happy until you see the other person's sadness in having lost. Then all your joy goes. Do you know why? Because no human heart was ever made that cannot empathizes with a person who is sad. You know what it is to be on the other side of the net, because you too have had days like that. Therefore, you cannot but pick up the other person's sadness immediately. Why? Because you can never hurt another without being hurt in the process. It is just not possible. We think that people given to crime have such hardened heart that they can automatically do harm to others. But this is not true. Even psychopaths have their spells of empathy because of how the human heart is. All human beings must follow the order of dharma. That you cannot hurt another without being hurt in the process is the fact, for which there is a very simple rule. All human beings must follow what we call the order of dharma. This is the common basis for everyone, although it is not commonly pursued because of fundamental insecurities. This fundamental insecurity is the human problem. The insecure person acts in unbecoming ways because there are priorities for the person based on likes and dislikes. Wherever these priorities are, there will be confusions in terms of values, unless the person frees oneself from the sense of being small. The person does see the sameness in all beings always. Sarvatra samana pasyati. It is very clear to such a person that whatever is good for oneself is good for others also. This is the yogi whom Krishna praises here. From a mature person who tries to follow dharma will breach it now and again, because some priorities or the others will always be there. Thus you find that there is legitimate criticism, legitimate hurting, because you cannot always take the hurt, sometime you will hurt back. Sometime you are going to give it back. And this is considered to be a legitimate in human interaction. Only a jnani is able to view sukha and dukkha in the same manner. Therefore, only a jnani can be free, which is why, with the reference to all people, he or she is considered to be the most exalted. Sayogi paramo mataha. So we have these two ways of looking at the verse. The first in keeping with the Shastra and the other in terms of behavior. One refers to the vision of the person and the other is expression in others' interaction. Having said this much, the topic of dhyana, yoga, meditation, contemplation is complete. In fact, Krishna has actually covered the topic twice in two different ways. Thinking that he had done a good job, Krishna may have sat back and bit. Seeing that Krishna has finished, Arjuna thinks it is a good time to ask a question and does so in next two verses. And what does he ask? The nature of Arjuna's problem is very clear. So we'll just read the verse number 33 and 34. Arjuna uvacha. Yoyam yogastvaya proktaha samena madhusudana etasya aham na pashyami chanchalatvat sthiram. In verse number 33, he says, Arjuna uvacha said, Madhusudana, O slayer of Madhu, Krishna, Tavya, by you, Samanena, the sameness, Ya ayam yoga, this yoga, Proktaha, which was talked about, Itasya, on of this, Sthiram, steady, Sthitam, state, Chanchalatvat, due to agitation, Aham, I, na pasyami, do not see. Arjuna says, Hey Madhusudan, O Krishna, this yoga that you have talked about as sameness, I don't see its steady vision due to agitation of the mind. Here Arjuna presents this problem, saying that this vision of sameness that Krishna has just talked about was not as simple as it seemed. Given the condition of his own mind, he describes his mind as agitated, chanchala. In fact, later he is going to say agitation is mind. Because of this agitation, Arjuna does not think that there is such thing as a steady vision of sameness. And even if there were, it would have been very difficult to deal with this mind. In order to gain such a vision, Arjuna presents a problem that everyone can identify with, one that is very common for anyone who has a mind. What Krishna has taught thus far seemed to have gone into Arjuna's head, but still he has a very valid doubt. For him, the whole teaching seems to boil down to two things. The mind that is composed and steady is the proper respectable for this knowledge, and the knowledge had to be clear. This clarity could perhaps be gained easily by proper inquiry and so on, if the mind were composed and steady. Therefore, Arjuna's question relates to means for making the mind steady. Mind steady, mind is chanchala. He finds his mind very turbulent. He also says that it has its own roots. This proves that there is consideration, that he proves that what is considered to be the modern psychology can also be found in the Gita. The mind does not seem to follow any rational way of operating. One may reason very clearly about how silly the mind can be, but still it had its own roots and its own modes of thinking. Therefore, Arjuna is asking in sense whether there is a means, upaya, for making this mind steady enough to gain the knowledge. बिजनेस में माइंड अस्थिर रहता है. How does one gain the mind that can gain a vision? Introducing Arjuna's question, Shankara indicates that the yoga Krishna has been discussing thus far, that is, seeing the sameness in everything, has the status of being difficult to gain. Seeing that it is difficult to gain, यथो यथोक्तस्य संयोग दर्शन लक्षण योगस्य दुःख संपद्यत्म alakshaya. Arjuna wants to know the ways and means of gaining a mind that will easily assimilate this knowledge. That which is common in everything, the truth of everything, is called Samayoga Darshana or Atma Darshana, the vision of the sameness that is Brahman, that is Atma, because this vision is gained through the mind. Arjuna wants to know how to gain that particular frame of mind through which the knowledge could be gained. Arjuna addresses Krishna as Madhusudana, meaning destroyer of Madhu. Madhu is a demon, the name of the demon Krishna had slain. Madhu means honey and is another name for ego, ahankara in Sanskrit. Madhu means ahankara in Sanskrit. So, Madhusudana, the destroyer of ego. Everyone loves his or her own ego and wants to fatten it up. It seems, as a teacher, Krishna was capable of destroying this ahankara, the false ego, with right knowledge, and which is why Arjuna addresses him as Madhusudana here. Arjuna wants Krishna to know that he does not think he could have this abiding vision of sameness. Occasionally he might have a little insight, but he knows that his mind does not remain steady for very long. Nobody's mind here. This is what the problem is. That this is a valid point of Arjuna. But he knows that his mind does not remain steady for very long. Not only does Arjuna sees how this vision could remain steady, but he also knows the reason. It is because his mind is always in state of agitation, chanchalatva. Because his mind is always in this state, he does not see the possibility of an abiding vision. The mind seems to have its own logic, its own roots, and even though he might gain some knowledge, that knowledge seems to have its own quarter, with no connection between the two. Naturally, then Arjuna wants to know what could it be done about this. Arjuna says mind is agitation. Mind is agitation. Chanchala hi manah Krishna paramathi balavradam. तस्याह निग्रहं मन्ये वायोरिव दुष्करम. Krishna, O Krishna, he in fact Manaha, mind, chanchalam is agitation, paramati, torrent, balavat, strong, dardham, well rooted, dardham, aham, I, tasya, of it, nigraham, control, yo eva, as the wind, sudu, sudushkarma, too difficult, impossible to do, manye, think. In fact, Krishna, the mind is agitation, a strong, well rooted torrent. I think it is impossible to control the wind. It is like a wind, flows, keeps flowing. This question we will take in detail. It's a very important question put up by Arjuna. We must understand this, that mind is absolute chanchala. How to control this mind? Then we will go into the answer. For today it is okay. Verse number 34 we'll see tomorrow. Om Tat Sat. Om Purnamadaha Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudashyate Purnasya Purnimadaya Purnamevavasishyati. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Harihi Om Tat Sat. Om Gurubhyo Namaha. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Krishnaya Govindaya. Om Namo Bhagavate